we were doing at all times is moving towards entire self-sufficiency within Scotland, unpaid volunteer donors from Scotland. The amount of blood being collected went up something like 6 times, certainly the amount of plasma that was being collected in order to make the products. So there was a lot of pressure to maintain this so that we could avoid having to import US paid donor plasma.
The fact that blood donors in the US were paid meant they were more likely to hide high-risk behaviour, such as drug use. But there was another reason for these donors to be avoided.
Many of the concerns about imported commercial products during the course of the 1970s and early 1980s was that the plasma that was collected for the manufacture of those products came from prisons. So it would be wrong for a voluntary blood bank to mirror collection of plasma from a high-risk location.
But Scotland, which had a voluntary blood bank, did. The Blood Transfusion Service has revealed it visited nearly all prisons until 1984, and it says this was acceptable.
There was sufficient, unfortunately, hepatitis C in Scotland to mean that there would have been contamination of these sources anyway, and that with the small amount of blood being collected from prisons, I don't really think that it contributed in any meaningful way, in any measurable way, to increasing the risk.
Other countries took a very different approach, because there was evidence that prisoners were a higher risk for hepatitis.
Prisoners were also judged as high-risk donors because there were a lot of IV drug users among them, and so I think that it was common sense not to collect blood also from prisoners. And that was even before the HIV problem. And once you had the HIV problem in Europe and you know that you were collecting blood from prisoners, I think you should immediately stop with that.
It was an issue brought up by the government's medical inspectors. Reports we read from 1982 warned the Blood Transfusion Service that this practice should end, but it did not end for another 2 years. Why did you go against, so even the advice of the medicine inspectorates, who were advising against this at the time repeatedly over several years?
Well, we did actually take cognizance of that and stop doing it.
Eventually.
On the basis of that. Well, we stopped doing it. We phased it out and stopped. Yeah.
But it took several years.
Well, we phased it out and we stopped doing it.
Prisoners weren't the only high-risk donors used in the 1980s. The Blood Transfusion Service also chose to take blood from the US Navy, stationed at the base at Holyloch. We asked if this was a good idea.
Other people on US bases than American personnel exist, so these were opportunities for local people to donate as well, who are providing local services. Also, there is no donor exclusion criteria for people who come from abroad, and certainly US people from the United States, people from the United States forces were not exclusions, were not particularly high risk from HIV at that time.
In 1984, the US had one of the most affected populations. 6,000 people there had AIDS. Europe's ethical watchdog had already recommended countries avoid high-risk populations for disease.
During the course of the period 1983 to 1985, it was appreciated amongst the medical community that plasma donations from US donors were of significantly higher risk than would have been the situation in Europe.
That view is echoed by Keith Smith.
When US citizens are located in Europe, it would not have been wise to collect blood from them because it was a potential risk group.
Scotland was taking a gamble with patient safety. But with US donors, the transfusion service may have been lucky.
There is no evidence whatsoever that any of these donors that ever tested positive was one of these American people. So I don't think they were an issue. They were volunteers, they were healthy people, and they contributed.
As well as the choice of donor, it was important for blood products to be processed safely, which prevented mistakes or contamination. But the information we've seen raises serious questions about standards. So how good were the facilities?
It was important to develop Scottish self-sufficiency, to rely on Scottish plasma. And the activity and the work and the technology accelerated ahead of the facilities.
So the facilities weren't...
The facilities were small, they were cramped, and the staff who worked in them did a fantastic job to keep the plasma supplies coming through.
Reports carried out by the UK's medicines inspectors in the early 80s show standards fell well below what was expected and resulted in infection on one occasion.
The present buildings and facilities continue to fail to reach minimum standards. The surprising practice of retaining blood routinely at ambient temperature for up to 18 hours. Licences held by the centre expired on the 30th of June 1981 and have not been renewed.
Unbelievably, there was no obligation to have a licence because of a system called Crown Immunity.
Crown Immunity meant that it was not susceptible to regulation or licensing procedures. This was an allowance that was granted for the purposes of ensuring that the state wouldn't be subject to prosecution and subject to regulation. But it appears in this instance it was used as a method of avoiding proper standards. And that is inappropriate, to say the least.
Serious problems continued at the main production site until 1988. Crown Immunity wasn't lifted for a further 3 years.
We had the inspections, and some of the reports were quite a challenge, but we had the inspections, we acted on them over time, and by the time we did require to have a licence, all of our facilities were licensed at the first visit.
If a blood transfusion service doesn't appreciate the serious consequences associated with a failure to maintain proper standards, then the healthcare system in that country is heading for disaster.
Whilst the blood transfusion service produced Factor VIII, the care of each individual patient was in the hands of their haemophilia doctor. It was up to doctors to determine the best form of treatment, consider any risks, and discuss this with their patient. So how well were patients treated? Bill Wright is a keen walker and climber. His haemophilia is so mild that it didn't affect his life until an incident in 1986.
I was walking along a path to go rock climbing. I slipped in that path and I suffered a bit of pain, and I then continued to exercise. I went rock climbing and did all the things that young people in their 20s do. You know, we had a party that night and we messed around.
But a few days later, Bill was admitted to accident and emergency in Edinburgh with an internal bleed in his thigh.
The pain, to be honest, was so severe that I was crying out and I was weeping with it. And it got to the stage, frankly, where I really did not know what was happening that night.
The decision was taken by the house officer on duty to give him Factor VIII. The next morning, Bill woke up in hospital.
The doctor was there beside me, and he then told me that I was regarded as a haemophiliac and that I had been given Factor VIII and that I had a 50% chance of contracting hepatitis.
He lived his life as he had before, but soon became unwell. Within months, Bill learned he had been infected with hepatitis C. He now knows it could progress to liver disease.
I am now aware that I could go on, potentially, to develop cirrhosis and possibly liver cancer. But that's a possibility. And as I say, I mean, I still go hill walking, rock climbing, play tennis, and do all these sorts of things. So it's something that's hanging there, shall we say.
If Bill had been treated in England, he would never have contracted